The fluorescent lights in courtroom 3B cast harsh shadows across worn wooden benches and faded linoleum floors. Outside, the late afternoon sun struggled through grimy windows, but inside the Riverside County Municipal Building, time seemed suspended in bureaucratic amber. Clint Eastwood sat 3 rows back from the front, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the proceedings with the patient intensity of a man who had learned that the most important moments often arrived disguised as routine business. At 84, Clint carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades making decisions that mattered. His face, carved by sun and wind and the weight of years, remained impassive as he watched the small drama unfolding before him. The hearing was for a property rezoning request, the kind of local government meeting that usually drew only the directly affected parties and a handful of civic-minded retirees with nothing better to do on a Thursday afternoon. But this particular hearing had drawn Clint's attention for reasons that had nothing to do with property values or zoning ordinances. At the petitioner's table sat Maria Gonzalez, a woman in her 50s whose calloused hands and sun-weathered face spoke of decades working the land. She wore her best dress, navy blue with small white flowers, pressed but showing its age, and clutched a manila folder thick with documents and photographs. Across from her, behind a mahogany table that seemed imported from a more prosperous jurisdiction, sat 3 men in expensive suits representing Pinnacle Development Corporation. Their briefcases gleamed with brass fittings, their papers were organized in leather portfolios, and their confident smiles suggested they considered this hearing a formality rather than a genuine proceeding. The chairman of the zoning board, a thin man named Henderson with wire-rimmed glasses, and the manner of someone who had spent his career confusing procedure with purpose, called the hearing to order. We're here to consider petition ZR 2024-47, a request by Pinnacle Development Corporation to rezone 47 acres of agricultural land to commercial use for the construction of a shopping center and parking facility. Maria shifted in her chair, her fingers tightening on the folder that contained her family's history, her arguments, her desperate plea to save the farm that had been in her family for 3 generations. The petitioner will present their case first, Henderson announced, and the lead attorney for Pinnacle Development, a polished man named Carlton who looked like he had never spent a day outside an air-conditioned office, rose to speak. Clint watched Maria's face as Carlton began his presentation, noting the way her jaw tightened when he referred to her farm as underutilized agricultural property, the way her hands trembled slightly when he described the shopping center as a significant improvement to the local economy. For 20 minutes, Carlton painted a picture of progress, jobs, tax revenue, and modernization. He spoke of studies and surveys, of traffic patterns and demographic analysis, of the inevitable march of development that would benefit the entire community. When he finished, Henderson turned to Maria with the kind of perfunctory politeness that suggested her response was a legal requirement rather than a meaningful part of the process. Mrs. Gonzalez, you have 15 minutes to present your opposition to this petition. Chapter 2. Maria's story. Maria Gonzalez stood slowly, her hands still gripping the manila folder as if it contained the last pieces of her family's soul. When she spoke, her voice carried a slight accent that spoke of roots running deeper than the developer's quarterly profit projections. My grandfather bought this land in 1943, she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He was a bracero worker who saved every penny for 20 years to buy 47 acres that nobody else wanted because the soil was rocky and the irrigation was poor. She opened her folder and pulled out a black and white photograph, holding it up so the board could see a young man standing proudly next to a simple farmhouse. He built our house with his own hands. He cleared rocks from fields that are now growing the sweetest oranges in Riverside County. He never learned to read English, but he understood land, and he understood work, and he understood that some things are worth more than money. Carlton, the developer's attorney, shifted impatiently in his chair, clearly annoyed that this was taking longer than expected. Mrs. Gonzalez, Henderson interrupted, consulting his watch. Could you please focus on the specific zoning issues rather than family history? Maria's eyes flashed with something between anger and sorrow. Mr. Henderson, this is a zoning issue. This is about whether land that has fed families for 80 years should be paved over for another shopping center in a county that already has more empty storefronts than it knows what to do with. She pulled out another photograph, this one in color, showing neat rows of orange trees heavy with fruit, a modest farmhouse in the background, and 2 children playing between the trees. My children grew up on this land. They learned responsibility by caring for animals, learned patience by planting seeds and waiting for harvest. learned the value of work by picking fruit alongside their grandfather until he passed away 10 years ago. Maria's voice grew stronger as she spoke, the initial nervousness replaced by passionate conviction. Mr. Carlton talks about jobs. I employ 12 people year-round, 15 during harvest season. These aren't minimum wage retail jobs that disappear when the economy shifts. These are skilled agricultural positions that support families, that teach young people trades they can use anywhere, that contribute to feeding people instead of just selling them things they don't need. She pulled out a thick folder of papers. I have letters here from restaurants and markets that depend on our produce. I have testimonials from agricultural extension agents about our soil conservation practices. I have documentation of the wildlife habitat we maintain, the watershed protection our farming practices provide. Carlton was now checking his phone, making it clear that he considered Maria's presentation a waste of time. But most importantly, Maria continued, her voice rising slightly, I have the support of this community. I have petitions signed by over 400 local residents opposing this development. I have letters from teachers at the elementary school where my oranges provide healthy snacks for children whose families can't afford them. I have testimonials from veterans who found peace and purpose working on our farm after coming home from overseas. She looked directly at the 3 board members, trying to establish human connection with people who seemed determined to see her as an obstacle rather than a person. Pinnacle Development will build their shopping center, take their profits, and move on to the next project. But my family will live with the consequences forever. This isn't just about money or development or progress. This is about whether communities have the right to preserve the things that make them unique, or whether everything must eventually be sacrificed to corporate profit. Chapter 3. The Response. When Maria finished her presentation, Carlton rose again with the practiced ease of someone who had dismissed hundreds of similar appeals. With all due respect to Mrs. Gonzalez and her family's history, he began, his tone suggesting that respect was the last thing on his mind. We're not here to make decisions based on sentimentality or nostalgia. We're here to consider what's best for the economic development of Riverside County. He clicked open a leather portfolio and pulled out a series of glossy charts and graphs. The proposed shopping center will generate over $3 million annually in property taxes, will create 340 permanent jobs, and will serve a retail market that currently requires residents to drive 30 miles to access basic services. Carlton's presentation was slick, professional, designed to make Maria's heartfelt appeals seem naive and backward-looking. Mrs. Gonzalez employs 12 people on her farm. Our development will employ nearly 30 times that number. Mrs. Gonzalez talks about community character, but communities grow and change. What served the needs of Riverside County in 1943 may not serve its needs in 2024. He paused, looking directly at Maria with the kind of condescending smile that wealthy men reserve for people they consider obstacles to progress. Furthermore, while we respect Mrs. Gonzalez's attachment to her family's property, we should note that our offer to purchase her land is significantly above market value. She would be financially better off accepting our proposal than continuing to struggle with the challenges of small-scale agriculture in an increasingly difficult market. The word struggle hung in the air like an insult. Maria's face flushed with anger and humiliation. This is about economic reality, not emotional attachment, Carlton continued. Pinnacle Development has invested 2 years and considerable resources in planning this project. We've conducted environmental studies, traffic analyses, market research. We've done everything required by law and more. He gestured toward Maria dismissively. What Mrs. Gonzalez is asking for is essentially the right to block progress because she doesn't want to adapt to changing times. That's not how development works, and it's not how communities grow. Henderson nodded along with Carlton's presentation, clearly more impressed by professional charts than personal stories. Our position is simple, Carlton concluded. The highest and best use of this property is commercial development, not small-scale agriculture. The law supports our position, the economics support our position, and the future of Riverside County supports our position. He sat down with the confidence of someone who had never doubted the outcome of this hearing. Henderson consulted his notes and looked ready to call for a vote when a voice from the back of the room spoke with quiet but unmistakable authority. I'd like to ask Mr. Carlton a question. Chapter 4. The Question. Every head in the courtroom turned toward the voice. Clint Eastwood remained seated, but his presence suddenly filled the room in a way that made even the fluorescent lights seem to dim slightly. Henderson blinked in confusion. I'm sorry, sir, but this is a formal hearing. Public comment isn't scheduled until… I understand the procedure, Clint said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people listen whether they wanted to or not. But I have a question that might save everyone some time. Carlton looked annoyed. Mr. Henderson, I don't think it's appropriate to allow random interruptions from the gallery. Mr. Carlton, Clint said, rising slowly to his feet, I'm not random, and this isn't an interruption. I'm asking you a direct question about your presentation. The room fell silent. There was something in Clint's demeanor, not threatening but absolutely serious, that suggested this moment mattered more than anyone yet understood. What's your question? Henderson asked, clearly uncertain about how to handle this unexpected development. Clint looked directly at Carlton, his steel gray eyes steady and unblinking. Mr. Carlton, in all your research about the highest and best use of Mrs. Gonzalez's property, did you happen to investigate who owns the land directly adjacent to her farm? Carlton shifted uncomfortably. I'm not sure how that's relevant to… It's relevant because I own it, Clint said simply. All 600 acres surrounding Mrs. Gonzalez's farm. And I'm curious why your development company has been trying to force her to sell without bothering to approach me about the much larger parcel of land that would actually be necessary for your shopping center project. The color drained from Carlton's face. Henderson looked back and forth between Clint and Carlton like a spectator at a tennis match. We weren't aware, Carlton stammered. You weren't aware, Clint repeated slowly, that the land you're planning to develop is completely surrounded by property owned by someone who hasn't agreed to sell. You weren't aware that without access rights across my property, Mrs. Gonzalez's farm would be completely landlocked and therefore unusable for commercial development. Maria turned in her chair to stare at Clint, her eyes wide with confusion and growing hope. Furthermore, Clint continued, his voice never rising but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. You weren't aware that I've spent the last 5 years working with the county to have my entire 600 acres designated as permanent agricultural preserve, which would make any commercial development on the surrounding property impossible. Carlton was now frantically shuffling through papers, clearly searching for information that should have been basic to any development project. Mr. Carlton, Clint said, taking a step closer to the front of the room. How exactly were you planning to build a shopping center on property that can't be accessed by road and is surrounded by permanently protected farmland? Chapter 5. The Truth. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Carlton's polished confidence had evaporated, replaced by the look of someone realizing that his carefully constructed plans were built on foundations of sand. There must be some mistake, Carlton said, his voice lacking its earlier certainty. Our research indicated that the surrounding properties were available for purchase or easement agreements. Your research was wrong, Clint said flatly. And I'm beginning to wonder if it was wrong deliberately or just incompetently. Henderson was now looking deeply uncomfortable, sensing that this hearing had taken a turn that was going to reflect poorly on everyone involved. I'm sorry, what's your name? Henderson asked. Eastwood, Clint Eastwood. A murmur ran through the small crowd as people recognized the name and began to understand the implications of what they were witnessing. Mr. Eastwood, Henderson continued nervously, are you saying that this development project is not feasible? I'm saying that this development project was never feasible, and anyone who did 5 minutes of actual research would have known that. Clint's voice carried an edge of anger that was all the more intimidating for being completely controlled. Which raises the question of what this hearing is really about. He turned to look directly at Maria, who was watching the exchange with growing amazement. Mrs. Gonzalez, how long has Pinnacle Development been pressuring you to sell your property? 2 years, Maria replied, her voice stronger now. They've called, sent letters, even showed up at my house. They said if I didn't sell voluntarily, they'd use eminent domain to force me out. And did they ever mention that the land around your property wasn't available for their project? No. They said the development was definitely going forward, with or without my cooperation. Clint nodded grimly. Mr. Carlton, that sounds like fraud to me. making representations about a development project that you knew was impossible, threatening a property owner with legal action you couldn't take, attempting to force a sale under false pretenses. Carlton was now pale and sweating. "Mr. Eastwood, I assure you there's been no deliberate misrepresentation." "Then you're incompetent instead of dishonest," Clint said. "I'm not sure which is worse." He turned to address the entire room, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades making decisions that affected other people's lives. "What we have here is a development company that either didn't do basic research about property ownership in the area they wanted to develop, or deliberately misrepresented the feasibility of their project to pressure a property owner into selling." Clint looked directly at Henderson. "Either way, this hearing is based on false premises. The development project as presented is impossible, and any vote to approve it would be meaningless." Chapter 6. The Revelation. Henderson was now visibly sweating, clearly realizing that this routine zoning hearing had become something much more serious. "Mr. Eastwood, are you saying that you would not grant access easements or sell portions of your property to make this development possible?" "I'm saying that my property is permanently protected agricultural land, which means I couldn't sell it for commercial development even if I wanted to, which I don't." Clint moved closer to the front of the room, his presence somehow making the spacious courtroom feel smaller and more intimate. "But more importantly, I'm saying that Mrs. Gonzalez shouldn't have to defend her family's farm against a project that was never legally possible in the first place." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder of his own. "I have here the original land surveys from when my property was purchased, the agricultural preserve designation documents, and correspondence with county planning that clearly establishes the development restrictions on my land. This information has been public record for 5 years." Clint placed the folder on the table where Carlton could see it. "Mr. Carlton, either your company failed to do basic due diligence, or you knew this information and chose to proceed anyway, hoping you could pressure Mrs. Gonzalez into selling before anyone questioned the viability of your project." Carlton finally found his voice. "Mr. Eastwood, Pinnacle Development is a reputable company. We would never engage in deliberate misrepresentation." "Then explain to me how you plan to develop property that you can't access." Carlton opened his mouth, but no words came out. Maria stood up, her earlier nervousness replaced by growing anger. "You mean they've been harassing my family for 2 years over a project that was never going to happen?" "That appears to be exactly what happened," Clint said. "And I suspect that if we dig deeper, we'll find that this isn't the first time Pinnacle Development has used this strategy." He turned to Henderson. "Mr. Henderson, I think this hearing should be suspended until the county attorney can investigate whether fraud has been committed." Henderson was now clearly out of his depth. That's not really within the scope of a zoning hearing." "Then maybe we should make it within the scope," Clint said. His voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath the quiet tone. "Because if companies can come before this board with projects they know are impossible and use the threat of eminent domain to pressure property owners into selling, then this entire process is corrupt." A photographer from the local newspaper, who had been dozing in the back row, was now taking pictures frantically, sensing that this routine zoning hearing had become front-page news. "Mrs. Gonzalez," Clint said, turning to face Maria directly. "Did anyone from the county or from Pinnacle Development ever tell you that you had the right to request an independent assessment of whether this development project was feasible?" "No," Maria said, her voice growing stronger with each answer. "They just kept saying that progress was inevitable and I could either cooperate or be forced out." "That's not how the law works," Clint said. "And that's not how decent people treat their neighbors." Chapter 7. The stand Carlton was now conferring frantically with his 2 associates, clearly trying to figure out how to salvage a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. Henderson was shuffling through papers as if searching for some procedural rule that could restore order to the hearing. But Clint Eastwood wasn't finished. "Mr. Henderson," he said, his voice cutting through the whispered conversations and nervous shuffling. "I want to make something clear for the record." The room fell silent again. Mrs. Gonzalez's farm isn't just a piece of property. It's a working agricultural operation that provides food, employment, and environmental benefits to this community. It's been in her family for 3 generations, and it represents exactly the kind of sustainable land use that we should be protecting, not destroying. Clint moved to stand beside Maria's chair, a gesture of solidarity that was not lost on anyone in the room. More importantly, Mrs. Gonzalez is a member of this community who deserves to be treated with respect and honesty, not subjected to 2 years of harassment and intimidation based on false claims. His eyes moved from Henderson to Carlton to the other board members. This hearing should never have been necessary. A competent development company would have done basic research and discovered that their project wasn't feasible. An honest development company would have told Mrs. Gonzalez the truth instead of trying to pressure her into selling based on threats they couldn't carry out. Carlton finally stood up, his earlier polish replaced by defensive anger. Mr. Eastwood, I resent the implication that Pinnacle Development has acted dishonestly. We've followed all legal procedures. You've followed procedures, Clint interrupted, but you haven't told the truth. And there's a difference. The two men stared at each other across the courtroom, and everyone present could feel the tension crackling between them. Mr. Carlton, Clint continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow becoming more intimidating rather than less. Mrs. Gonzalez has spent 2 years worrying that she was going to lose the farm her grandfather built. She's lost sleep, lost weight, spent money she couldn't afford on lawyers, all because your company either couldn't be bothered to do basic research or chose to proceed with false claims. He took a step closer to Carlton. How do you plan to make that right? Carlton's face flushed red. Mr. Eastwood, we're not required to… I'm not asking what you're required to do, Clint said. I'm asking what you're going to do. Because this isn't over just because your development project is dead. You've caused real harm to a real family, and that has consequences. The photographer was now taking pictures of the confrontation, clearly understanding that he was documenting something that would be talked about for years. Furthermore, Clint continued, I think the people of Riverside County deserve to know how many other property owners Pinnacle Development has subjected to this kind of treatment. How many other families have been pressured to sell based on false claims about inevitable development? Carlton was now looking desperately at Henderson, clearly hoping for some kind of intervention. But Henderson was staring at Clint with something approaching awe, finally understanding that he was in the presence of someone who wielded real power and wasn't afraid to use it. Chapter 8. The Moment. Clint Eastwood looked around the courtroom, taking in the faces of everyone present. Maria, still clutching her folder of family photographs. Carlton and his associates, now obviously eager to escape. Henderson and the other board members, clearly realizing that this hearing had become something much larger than a routine zoning decision. Let me tell you what's going to happen, Clint said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades making decisions that stuck. First, this zoning petition is going to be denied, not because of Mrs. Gonzalez's opposition, but because it's based on false premises. You can't approve a development project that's impossible to build. Henderson nodded frantically. Yes, absolutely, the petition is denied. Second, Clint continued, Mrs. Gonzalez is going to receive a written apology from Pinnacle Development acknowledging that she was subjected to harassment based on false claims, and compensating her for the legal fees and emotional distress she's experienced over the past 2 years. Carlton started to object. Now wait just a minute. Third, Clint said, his voice cutting off Carlton's protest. The county attorney is going to investigate Pinnacle Development's business practices to determine whether other property owners have been subjected to similar treatment. He turned to look directly at the photographer from the local newspaper. And fourth, this entire incident is going to be reported in detail, so that other communities can protect themselves from companies that use intimidation and false claims to pressure property owners into selling. The photographer was scribbling notes frantically, clearly understanding that he had stumbled into the biggest story of his career. Now, Clint said, turning back to Carlton, you have a choice. You can agree to make this right quietly and professionally, or you can fight it and have this become a very public and very expensive legal battle that you're going to lose. Carlton looked around the room, clearly hoping for support that wasn't coming. What's it going to be? Clint asked. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Carlton finally spoke. Pinnacle Development will review Mrs. Gonzalez's situation and work toward an amicable resolution. That's not good enough, Clint said. I want a specific commitment. How much are you going to pay Mrs. Gonzalez for the harm you've caused? Carlton's face went through several shades of red before he finally answered. We could consider a settlement in the range of $50,000. Maria gasped. It was more money than her farm made in 2 good years. $100,000, Clint said without hesitation. Plus a written apology acknowledging wrongdoing, plus agreement to submit to investigation by the county attorney. That's completely unreasonable, Carlton sputtered. What's unreasonable, Clint replied, is harassing a family for 2 years based on lies. $100,000, or we'll see you in court and let a jury decide how much your dishonesty is worth. Chapter 9. The Resolution. 20 minutes later, Clint Eastwood and Maria Gonzalez stood in the parking lot outside the municipal building, while Carlton and his associates huddled near their rental car, making frantic phone calls to their corporate headquarters. "I can't believe this is really happening," Maria said, her voice still shaky with emotion. 2 years of worrying, of barely sleeping, of thinking I was going to lose everything my grandfather built. "It's over," Clint said simply, "and it should never have started." Maria looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. "Mr. Eastwood, can I ask you something? How did you know to be here today? How did you know what was happening to my farm?" Clint was quiet for a moment, looking out across the parking lot toward the hills where both their properties lay under the late afternoon sun. "Maria, I've lived in this county for 30 years. I know every farm, every family, every piece of land that matters. When I heard that someone was trying to force you off your property, I started asking questions. But why? Why did you care what happened to my farm?" Clint turned to look at her directly. "Because your grandfather and I served together in Korea." Maria's eyes widened. "You knew my grandfather?" "Eduardo Gonzalez, best soldier I ever served with. Saved my life twice, once in combat and once when I got sick with pneumonia and he nursed me back to health in a field hospital." The revelation hit Maria like a physical blow. "He never mentioned... I never knew." "Your grandfather was a private man, didn't talk much about the war. But he talked about his plans for the future, about the land he was going to buy, about the family he was going to raise." Clint smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face. "He used to show me pictures of those 47 acres. Rocky, poor soil, no irrigation. But he saw something there that nobody else could see. He had vision." Maria felt tears building in her eyes. "You've been watching over our farm all these years?" "I've been keeping an eye on things, making sure your grandfather's dream stayed alive." "Is that why you bought the surrounding land?" "Partly, but mostly because it's good land that deserves to be protected, and because some promises matter more than money." Carlton approached them cautiously, clearly reluctant to interrupt but needing to resolve the situation. "Mr. Eastwood, Mrs. Gonzalez, I've spoken with my company's headquarters. We're prepared to offer Mrs. Gonzalez $100,000 in compensation, plus a written acknowledgement of our mistakes, plus cooperation with any county investigation." Clint nodded. "And you'll also agree to place Mrs. Gonzalez's property on a do not contact list for all future development inquiries?" "Yes, absolutely. And you'll make a public statement acknowledging that this development project was never feasible and that Mrs. Gonzalez was right to oppose it?" Carlton winced but nodded. "Yes." "Good. Mrs. Gonzalez will review the written agreement before signing anything. And Carlton, yes? If Pinnacle Development ever contacts Mrs. Gonzalez again about selling her property, or if I hear about you using these tactics against other property owners, you'll have bigger problems than a county investigation." Carlton nodded rapidly and retreated to his car. Chapter 10. The Legacy. 6 months later, Clint Eastwood sat on the porch of Maria Gonzalez's farmhouse, watching the sun set over the orange groves that Eduardo Gonzalez had planted 70 years earlier. The trees were heavy with fruit, and the air was sweet with the scent of orange blossoms. Maria emerged from the house carrying 2 glasses of iced tea and settled into the chair beside him. "The settlement check cleared," she said. $100,000, exactly as promised. "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm going to do what my grandfather would have wanted. Half goes into an account for my children's education. The other half goes into improving the farm, new irrigation, soil conservation, maybe expanding the organic certification." Clint nodded approvingly. "Your grandfather would be proud." "There's something else," Maria said. "I've been talking with some of the other small farmers in the county. Turns out Pinnacle Development approached several of them with similar tactics, threatening eminent domain, claiming development was inevitable, pressuring them to sell. And we're forming a cooperative, a legal defense fund and information network to help small farmers deal with predatory development companies. We're calling it the Eduardo Gonzalez Agricultural Protection Alliance." Clint smiled. "That's a good name. We want you to be the honorary chairman." "I'm honored, but I think you should run it yourself." You know what farmers need better than I do." Maria looked out over the groves where her children were playing between the trees, just as she had done 40 years earlier. "Mr. Eastwood, can I ask you something personal?" "Shoot." "Why didn't you ever tell me about serving with my grandfather? All these years you could have introduced yourself, could have shared stories about him." Clint was quiet for a long moment. "Because some things are better shown than said. Your grandfather didn't want his granddaughter to know him as a soldier. He wanted you to know him as a farmer, a builder, a man who created something lasting. But you could have helped us earlier, when the farm was struggling, when we had bad years." "I did help. Who do you think bought your fruit when other buyers were offering below cost? Who do you think recommended your farm to those restaurants and markets? Who do you think made sure the county never changed the zoning laws that protect agricultural land?" Maria stared at him in amazement. "You've been helping us for years without us knowing? That's what promises are for. Your grandfather saved my life. I promised him I'd look after his family if anything happened to him. Some promises don't have expiration dates." As the sun disappeared behind the hills, the two of them sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of a working farm, the rustle of wind through orange trees, the distant lowing of cattle, the laughter of children who would grow up understanding the value of land and family and keeping one's word. "Mr. Eastwood, yeah? Thank you. For everything. For protecting the farm, for standing up to those developers, for keeping my grandfather's promise. You don't need to thank me, Maria. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep the land productive, keep your family strong, and keep fighting for what matters." "I will." "Good. That's all any of us can do." Epilogue: The words that mattered. 1 year after the hearing that saved Maria Gonzalez's farm, the local newspaper ran a feature story about the Eduardo Gonzalez Agricultural Protection Alliance and its success in helping small farmers resist predatory development practices. The article included a sidebar titled, "The Day One Man's Word Changed Everything," which detailed how Clint Eastwood's intervention had exposed Pinnacle Development's fraudulent practices and led to a county investigation that resulted in new protections for agricultural property owners. But the most important part of the story was a quote from Maria Gonzalez about the moment that had turned everything around. "Mr. Eastwood didn't make a big speech or create a scene. He just asked one simple question that exposed the truth. Sometimes that's all it takes. One person willing to stand up and demand honesty." When asked what that question was, Maria smiled. He asked how they planned to develop property they couldn't access. It was such a basic question that it revealed how their entire project was built on lies. But it wasn't really about the question itself. It was about someone finally caring enough to ask it. The article concluded with a statement from Clint Eastwood himself, the only public comment he made about the incident. "Some fights are worth having, and some promises are worth keeping. When you see someone being pushed around based on lies, you've got a choice. You can stay silent and let it happen, or you can speak up and stop it. That's not complicated, that's just being decent." But for those who had been in the courtroom that day, the most memorable moment wasn't any of the questions or revelations or confrontations. It was the simple statement Clint had made when he first stood up to challenge the developers. "I'd like to ask Mr. Carlton a question. 7 words that changed everything. 7 words that exposed a fraud, saved a farm, and reminded a community that sometimes the most powerful intervention is just someone willing to speak the truth at the right moment." In the end, it wasn't what Clint Eastwood said that mattered most. It was that he said anything at all.